Great. Okay, I think I might get started. Hi again, everyone. Thank you for joining us, and good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening, in whichever part of the world you're from. Welcome to the Templeton World Charity Foundation second webinar on human flourishing. My name is Dawid Potgieter. I'm the Director for Programs and Discovery Science, and I led the Grand Challenges for Human Flourishing program. Today's webinar is the second in a series of events that will explore the distinct challenges and opportunities relating to advancing the science of human flourishing. Today's session will focus on the stories that we tell ourselves and others, the importance of listening well, and the role of emotions in social interactions. Joining me for today's discussions are some recent TWCF awardees who have received initial funding to pursue research through the Grand Challenges for Human Flourishing initiative. And so I'm delighted to welcome Brie Linkenhoker, who's the founder of Worldview Studio, which is a small firm that tries to connect science and society through media and design. Also, very pleased to welcome Netta Weinstein, who's the associate professor or an associate professor from the University of Reading, and working with her as a collaborator, Guy Itzchakov, assistant professor at the University of Haifa in Israel. And we're also very pleased to welcome Jordan Mansell from Western University Network for Economic and Social Trends. So thank you again for joining us, and welcome to this webinar. This really is a wonderful topic, and I'm so excited that we can discuss it. I think a good place to start off would be if each of you could just take a few minutes to tell us about yourselves and your research idea that you and your colleagues are pursuing, and why you think this is important for human flourishing. And I'll ask Brie to start.
Sure. So I'm Brie Linkenhoker. As Dawid mentioned, I lead Worldview Studio. My own background is in neuroscience and behavioral economics, but I've moved in and out of academia over my career with a real interest in trying to unite or bring together more of what our academics in universities are learning with people out in the non-academic world who can put that knowledge to use. And that's really what our firm is all about. So Dawid, should I go ahead and talk about our project, or do you want to move on? Sure. So about 5 minutes on the project itself.
Great, right. Yes.
Okay. So our project began with a focus on the power of the stories we tell ourselves, the narratives that we hold about the way that the world works, our place in it, what we can expect from each other, and what the future is likely to hold. So we know from a broad, diverse research literature that I can go into more deeply in the discussion that these stories have tremendous power to shape our choices, our behaviors, our social interactions, and that's largely due to the way they structure what we expect, what we attend to in the world, what and whom we trust, how we assess new or surprising information, and what kind of agency we believe we have to act or to change a situation. So we think of these stories we tell ourselves as being related to concepts in psychology like cognitive schema and mindsets, but also to ideas from the broader social sciences like worldviews, in some cases attitudes, but also to the dominant narratives common to our culture's stories and myths that we might get from our study of literature, and to our own experience as individuals, especially insofar as we feel that we belong where we are and where we want to be, and that we have the knowledge needed to understand what's going on around us, and that we have agency, again, to act in ways that align with those values. So that's a lot. It's a lot of connections to a lot of different ideas. But the fundamental idea here that we're pursuing is that these stories we tell ourselves, sometimes consciously, often subconsciously, have incredible power. And they're also accessible to intervention, as we've seen in cases ranging from interventions that reduce the probability of child abuse by changing the story that parents are telling themselves about why their children are acting up. We've seen interventions that can decrease school suspensions by changing the way that teachers that tell stories about why their students might be acting up and the causes of that acting up. We've seen story interventions that increase academic achievement in college, that improve pain management and post-operative outcomes. So you can see across many different areas, these stories that we tell ourselves really shape our own experience of the world. We also know that using stories can be more effective at changing, for example, pro-environmental behavior than, say, just providing plain information. So when we started this project, we were interested in a really broad suite of these stories we tell ourselves and story interventions that could promote human flourishing. But since then, we've become more interested specifically in the stories we tell ourselves about science, and especially what science is, how it works, and the role it can and should play in our lives and decision-making. I suspect you all can imagine why we might have gotten really interested in science in the last year and a half. We've been doing a project on communicating to vaccinate. We've been deep in the research literature on vaccine hesitancy. That's not a surprise. But we also know that as we look ahead and we think about what human flourishing is going to look like in the next 10, 20, 30, 50 years, we as a society are going to need to make decisions that are driven by data, that are driven by science, about things like climate change and how much we're going to intervene in our climate, about how we're going to interact with artificial intelligence, what bounds we're going to place on our biotechnology and our tools that are emerging that could really change who we are as humans. So, Margaret Levy, a political scientist that at Stanford that I spoke to a few years back, said, the sign of a healthy society is one in which we can agree on the same facts, but disagree about what they mean, about what we should do, and maybe even disagree about what caused them. But we've got to start from the same place. And so far in our society, since the time of the Enlightenment, science has given us those facts, and we've done a pretty good job of trusting them and starting from the same place, and then disagreeing about what they mean and where to go from there. But those foundations are crumbling now. And what we're learning over the last 20 to 30 years is that trust and authority generally is decreasing. And what that's revealing is that we have really different ideas in our society about what science is. Some of us think that science is a way of knowing. Some of us think that science is a collection of subjects. Some of us think that science is an industry in which people are seeking power or fame or money. Other people think that science is, a collection of stories that may or may not be true. So we want to go in, we want to use these stories we tell ourselves framework to really dive in, not just to what people trust about science or how much trust they have, but really into what they believe science is and how that influences their way of knowing about the world, and then how that moves into and shapes our interactions with other people. Because we believe that we're coming at really difficult conversations in this polarized world we're living in now from really different places in terms of our understanding of what science is. So we're going to be using deep listening interviews that really go into people's worldviews about what science is, both directly and indirectly. We're going to be doing a lot of listening, and we're going to listen to Netta in a little bit, tell us how to listen better. But our whole goal by the end of the project is to really have a set of clear hypotheses that we can test more broadly at a larger level about the stories people are telling themselves about not just science, but about the ways in which we can and should learn about the world, and understand how that then plays out for us as scientists or communicators of science, or people who are just trying to navigate the conflicts that we're seeing more and more in our society. So that's our project in a kind of nutshell. And I'm happy to take questions, I think, after the other people introduce their projects as well.
Sure, yes, thank you, Brie, and thank you also for that reminder. We've got a Q&A feature here, so if you have questions, just pop them in there, and we'll get to them a bit later on in this session. We might also answer them directly, but yeah, please add your questions there if you have any. Starting from the power of stories, which of course requires us to listen well. We'll have our segue to the importance of listening, and there I will invite Netta and Guy to please talk a bit about your project in this context.
I muted, wasn't I? Is that better? Okay, good. So I'm Netta, and just a bit about my background. I come from a clinical psychology background, so I was trained as a clinician and a researcher at the same time. And during my training, the focus from a clinical angle was really learning how to listen in a very practical way. That was a big chunk of my studies, was learning how to listen to people share their stories, their difficulties, their conflicts. And then alongside that, my research was on human motivation and well-being, trying to understand what is optimal human motivation? How do we get buy-in? How do we inspire people? How do we encourage people to change for the better? What does that mean for their sense of well-being, emotional well-being, and their growth and integration? So also across time, thinking about organisms as working and moving towards growth, and how can we facilitate that in our social context? And, Guy, feel free to share if you want to give your perspective, but when Guy and I started working on the topic of listening, Guy's approach was a very different one. It came from a more purely research standpoint around the topic of listening, the role it has in organizations, the role it has in attitudes, the role it has in defensiveness. And a lot of the things that I was fascinated by, coming both from my clinical training and my research on motivation, those were the things that, when I talked to Guy, I really got a new understanding of, why the things that were important to me, how we could really support those things, how can really encourage well-being, how can really change attitudes. So we started to sort of go down this journey of trying to understand listening, what it looks like, how we can encourage it, and all sorts of other things that actually I'll talk about a little bit in the next few minutes. So for us, and for me and Guy, I'm speaking for you, so do feel free to pitch in. But, I think we see listening at the heart of dialogue, at the heart of conversation. And often when we think about conversation, we'll tend to think about the speaker and the speaker's role. What is the person saying? What is communicated? But actually, we see the listener as a really important active participant in that conversation. Somebody or groups of individuals who drive the direction the conversations are going, how well they go, how people learn from them, and how they affect well-being and emotions and cognitions. So the listener is an important active participant, and can have a lot of influence as a social agent, both, when you think about the impact they have on the person they're talking to, but even in a bigger picture, how they impact the communities, societies, networks around them. So there's a lot of power there. And I think intuitively practitioners see that power. When you think about therapists, my own therapy training, we didn't talk about listening as a research area, but we understood that it's an important part of creating change, fostering insight, and encouraging our clients to explore themselves non-defensively. So clinicians see this, coaches see this when they work on inclusion in organizations. Journalists talk about the importance of listening for their work. Brie was talking about the importance of listening for gaining knowledge in the work that she does. And so I think we implicitly all place this big emphasis on listening without really understanding in a systematic way what it involves, what are the impacts that it has on people, what are its boundary conditions, where does it not work. There's a lot for us to learn in it. One of the things that we've really tried to understand is, what does good listening convey or look like? You know, what does it mean for this active participant? What are they active in? And some of the things that we've really focused on are the role of the listener, both in showing the speaker that they are really attending to what they have to say. So, you know, a really good listener creates the space for someone to talk and to express themselves and to explore aspects of themselves without disruptions, without immediate judgments. And so a second part of that is really about the listener conveying that they value the speaker and they value that space in the moment. And that's quite tough. We're going to talk a lot about polarization and conflict and disagreement. It's really hard to do that valuing under those circumstances. But a good listener in an ideal circumstance sets aside some of their own reactions, attitudes, biases, and hears what the person says and values that individual as an end in themselves, even if they don't agree or approve with everything that's being said. So a good listener conveys that valuing or that closeness or that respect for the speaker. And that's important. Attention and creating that space isn't enough if you don't have that valuing. And then when we think about what good listening really looks like, we talk about understanding, comprehension, that it's not just enough to listen, it's not just enough to show you like somebody, but we really try to understand what the speaker is saying, and to feel understood is very important to people. And that's something, a gift the listener can provide to the speaker to show, I created this space for you and I get it. I get what's going on for you, even if it's quite difficult or complicated, or I get the essence of it. So there are these specific ways that we create the space for the speaker to express, and that the good listener it is willing to do that and conveys that mind frame of openness to the speaker. And thinking about the benefits, you know, when we think about what it feels like for us to be listened to in that way, especially when it really matters, for disclosing something difficult, or, you know, something we're embarrassed by, or something, some secret we've had, or just our feeling, our vulnerability, to receive that quality of listening, it feels good. You know, that's the kind of, I think, simple way of saying that it feels good to be listened to. But what we've found, and what researchers are starting to really identify, is that what listening does is it creates that sense of openness, that sense of relational value, that yes, we do value and respect one another. You know, that sense of I'm open and willing to explore myself and have that self-insight even when it's difficult, because my relational space is a safe relational space where I can do that. So for us, this high quality listening creates the opportunity for this non-defensive self-exploration. And we see that speakers who receive that kind of listening, they have a sense of well-being, they have that sense of openness, they're willing to be more flexible and open in their attitudes, again, under very specific circumstances. And so there's a lot of opportunity to learn more about all these things, and a lot of places for us to go, but there's kind of good reason to believe right now that we're, when we listen well, we create that really positive relational space. And so, you know, we think that the listener can be a social agent. The listener might, the high quality listener might play a role in reducing polarization and reducing discord, and helping to create meaning and values that are more pro-social and have more universalist values embedded in them. So there's a lot of opportunity there. And then on the other side of it, the listener themselves can benefit from the process of this open listening, because first, they themselves find themselves in this more positive relational space where people are working together, but also they have the opportunity to learn more about what is being said in the moment, because they've created this space for that and set aside their kind of gut reactions, whatever they are. So this, you know, to us, I think the science of listening is still quite young. There's really a lot of opportunity, a lot of, you know, possibility here. And it's a very exciting place to begin to explore these questions. And I think, you know, what I wanted to do was kind of focus a little bit on some of the questions, and I know in just a few minutes, you know, some of the things where we can go, and our project is tapping at some of these issues, but I think across years, there's a lot of work to be done here. One of the things to focus on is, can we teach people to listen, and how do we teach people to listen? Does it take years, or can it be done in a simpler, more efficient way? And the reality of it is, and this is something I learned from Guy, we can't, my idealistic thing is, let's get everybody listening to one another. But actually, Guy's like, we can't get everybody to listen. We can't train the whole world to be good listeners. So one of the key things for us is to identify those key agents that we might encourage to be better listeners, that can create social change. So thinking about, can we encourage listening? How efficiently, how well can people detect when somebody's become a good listener? How does listening affect dialogue and conversation and narratives and stories? How does it change for the speaker, for the person who's sharing their experiences? Change the emotions that they have, the intentions that they have on where they want to take things forward, the kind of learning that they do. What is the reach of listening? How far can we take this? How much can we change by encouraging, manipulating, training, just increasing, I think, listening, high quality listening in the world, and really helping people to understand what this means and how to go about it. And then there's the other side, which is, it's nice to be idealistic about it, but there are certainly limitations to what listening can do. And sometimes it's not enough to listen. We need to think about listening as a foundation that then might need to be paired with a challenge, or something that's hard to hear, something people don't want to hear, a reframing of an attitude or an experience. So, listening has boundary conditions, and we know very little about what those are. And that's a really important next step, because if we go and think we can solve all our world's problems through listening alone, we might find that reality doesn't quite work that way. And then finally, one of the things that's going to be really important moving forward is to think about this across cultures. So, Guy and I work in Israel, in the UK, and the US primarily, but actually to be able to study listening across many cultures, across many types of relationships, domains, content of conversations, it might not always look the same to listen well. People might need different kinds of listening in different contexts or cultures or relationships. We know very little about this. And so there's a lot of benefit moving forward to really diversifying, not just, what are the outcomes, or how much can we do with listening, but what does it look like across the world, will be a really important question for us to answer. And that's me. And Guy, I don't know if you want to add.
Can I add, Dawid, or are we out of time?
Yeah, we've got 1 minute or so. Yes.
Okay, so I think I of course agree with everything Netta said, and I think one of the things that we learned over the years is that the listener is not a passive actor, as many people think, that listening is smiling and nodding your head. For example, if you think about a time when you talk to someone and suddenly they frowned, or they folded their arms, or ask you an irrelevant question, how did it change? Brie talked about stories. How did it change your story? The listener is quite an influential agent in the conversation, and good listeners know how to recognize the doors that the speakers open for them in their stories, and know how to provide the reflection in the right moment and ask the good question that helps the speaker to gain insight on their own stories, making them, as Netta pointed out, helping them change, revisit their emotions and attitudes and perspectives. We know that it is easier to listen to stories than to listen to facts. However, one of the things we know much less about is the role of the listener. How can we make people listen to stories that they object to, that they are on the other end of, because people are automatically become defensive and close their minds. And if we want to create a flourishing on our connected society, we need to have people communicate with one another as a means to creating some common ground. And in order to do it, we have to have good listening. And how do we do it when people have such opposite stories that they come from. And this is, although it is challenging, but we do have evidence about the power that listening has and what it can do, and the potential. So this is one thing we are, like, one of our big questions that we want to try to pursue.
I loved what Netta said about being listened to makes us feel good, but then it's also, it contrasts with sometimes it being very, very difficult to listen, especially as you said, Guy, when we disagree with what is being said, and I think that's a perfect segue for the next topic to discuss, which is the role of emotions in all of this. So I asked Jordan to give us a bit of an overview of your project, please.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Dawid. So my name is Jordan Mansell. I'm the Network for Economic and Social Trends at Western University. I'm one member of sort of a large interdisciplinary research team, which is based at Western, but includes 9 researchers at multiple universities in Canada and the US, as well as an NGO organization based in Toronto. So our project is entitled Psychological Barriers to Human Flourishing, applying research on emotions to reduce prejudice. So what is the motivation of this project? Well, prejudice is a significant barrier to human flourishing in democratic societies. Prejudicial attitudes have negative social and economic consequences for the victims of discrimination. This includes the erosion of core values like equality on which democratic institutions function. Individuals who experience prejudice or discrimination in their daily lives have lower levels of personal efficacy. They're significantly less likely to participate in public life. They have poor health outcomes, lower levels of educational attainment, and career development. So it also influences how we perceive public officials, elected representatives, as well as the performance of government. So prejudice damages the stability of social and economic development, and this diminishes interpersonal connections. And these are all key pillars of human flourishing. Traditionally, social scientists have tried to study prejudice using theories of socialization and experience. These are still important, but social scientists using these approaches are really struggling to explain recent increases in prejudicial attitudes in North America and Europe. But I think a very recent and relevant example is the increase in sort of anti-Asian attitudes that sort of accompanied the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. But in response, the social sciences are evolving, and we're drawing more and more from this well-developed literature in psychology on human emotion and cognition. And our project is going to use this literature, and we're going to study emotions as a psychological system influencing prejudice. So what we're specifically interested in is how the suppression and reappraisal of negative emotions in combination to the expression of moderation, contributes to, the expression and moderation of prejudicial attitudes. So what that means, what we're interested in, what kinds of emotions do individuals experience towards outgroups, and what do they do with those emotions when they're experiencing them? How do they interact with them, especially their negative emotions? The goal of the project is to use this research to develop better anti-prejudice programs. And part of the project is that we're going to develop and test an experimental intervention which aims at reducing prejudice in a demographically and attitudinally diverse sample. And that intervention is going to focus on the reappraisal of negative emotions. Using your negative emotions, taking that experience, and reflecting on it in a more constructive way, and in the long term of hope of reducing the strong negative responses that are often associated with interacting with different groups. I'm going to pause there, Dawid, and if people have more specific questions about details, I'm happy to answer those.
Sure, absolutely, and we will definitely get a good amount of time for questions. I think it's one key thing that I hope we can touch on in this webinar is to explore some of the complexities of our social interactions, and I think all of you have already spoken to that to some extent. But what makes this really important is the fact that we live in this world where we're faced with increasing volumes of polarizing information. There's so much information, and so much of it is polarizing. We've got a global public health crisis and rising inequality and polarizing positions around those situations. And all of these things can interfere with our capacity to flourish. But at the same time, we really know more than ever about what it means to live a good life and how to let individuals and communities flourish. So yes, let's dig into these topics a little more with a few questions. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A feature. But in the meantime, I think I'll start off with a question about stories and emotions. I'd love to know, why do the stories that we tell ourselves have such a strong influence on us? And how do they interact with our emotions? And maybe Brie, you can start on this, but anybody else, please feel free to chip in if you'd like to.
Well, I'll just start by saying that we're storytelling creatures. I mean, that's who we've become in our evolutionary history as social primates who developed language. And it's the stories that we're able to share with each other that create social cohesion, that allow us to plan together. These narratives have incredible power, both because they're shareable, but also because of the way they organize our thoughts and our attention. We can't attend to everything in the world. We can't make sense of every little piece of stimuli that comes towards us. So the stories we tell ourselves are really developed early on as children about the way the world works. Who am I in this world? What can I expect from other people and why? And you see this in people who grow up in different cultures. The stories they tell themselves about themselves, other people, and how the world works work really differently. And they should, because they reflect their own reality. So, stories are powerful because they create this cascading effect, right? They order what we attend to, how we make sense of it, what we expect, but they also shape our range of what we think is possible for ourselves as individuals and in the world. They shape our expectations, and we know that when we have a certain expectation and then our experience deviates from that, especially if it undercuts it, we're very disappointed. So that alignment is a really big deal. So, and the reason we talk about stories rather than schema or mindsets or worldviews, all of which are important elements, is because stories are also those things that are contagious. They're shareable, they capture our attention. And as Guy mentioned, they're much more compelling to listen to, and people respond to them and learn better in listening to stories. So I think all of that is true, but in the connection to the emotions, I point out a couple of things, but there are other people on this call who know much more about emotions than I do. So one is that I think all of us experience dissonance that doesn't feel good when we interact with somebody who has a really different worldview, where we're not agreeing on the same kind of factual information to start with. Somebody who just sees the world in a different way, can't even explain that, but just you feel like you're talking like this, like just you're orthogonal to each other. That causes dissonance for us. And we want to try to resolve that. I think that's one of the things that Netta and Guy are going to be really digging into, right? Like when you encounter someone and you feel that way, what do you do in response? What does a good listener do? And we can't wait to hear more about that. But stories also activate us. And one of the really cool things that I've learned recently about emotion that I'm sure Jordan knows a ton about is that people across different cultures kind of long for different kinds of emotional experiences or understand different emotions as being kind of things to go for. In our country right now, a lot of us are driven by this kind of set of amping up, exciting emotions that come out of conflict. And you see this all over social media. But in other cultures, there's, more of an interest in cohesion, in agreeing, in feeling calm, and like we're united in the same goal. And we're not going to change those cultural things overnight, but we can acknowledge them, and we can acknowledge what they do to us and our physiology and our brains when we're experiencing those stories. And we can work with that as we go. So I'll leave it there because other people probably have other really cool things to say about this topic. And we can come back to the other things that are popping up in the chat soon.
Yeah, and I want to add something that the connection between the stories and the increased polarization that we see in society today, that often people try to match the story of the other person to their story. Because, like, for example, because like if Brie does not share the same story as I am, then I have to change her. So she will share the same story. And here, this is the point where we think that we miss a lot in terms of human flourishing, is that it is not about changing the story so everyone will have the same story or the same perspective. It is how we create a common ground above the different story, above this diversity, in order to create something that connects us. And in the view that Netta and I are holding, this is something that is really important in order to increase inclusion and flourishing and diversity, and whether it is for people from different culture that have differ in the way that they see things, or people on the opposite political spectrum. But it's not about changing the other person's story, which often results in what we call a boomerang effect, that people become even more polarized in the opposite direction. But how do we create the conditions for communities, for society in general, to build a bridge above the different stories in order to increase connection?
So something that's interesting about stories is I often think we use these sort of internal narratives, and we often use these to process and rationalize our experiences. These internal narratives can be highly positive. We can use them to work through different scenarios, to grow as individuals, to learn from mistakes, but they can also have negative consequences. We can use them to reinforce or justify negative feelings, negative emotions towards others, to justify polarizations towards the outgroup. I think what's interesting is there's a growing body of literature that suggests that the narratives we choose, we process our emotions, the kinds of stories we often adopt or dispose to, can also have long-term consequences for our health and well-being. Negative stories that we tell ourselves are associated with negative health outcomes, depression, anxiety, and depression. But more positive narratives, adopting more positive mindsets, even interpreting negative events with a positive story. This is more associated with positive life outcomes, positive life attainments, goal attainment, personal efficacy, and confidence. And so the way we interpret our world with stories has a lot of consequences that are not immediately available to the average person. You don't see these outcomes as you're going the story, but they happen on later in life and through repetition.
I think that's just right, Jordan. And as you were talking, I mean, growth mindset is popping up, right? And the placebo effect. I mean, these are really deep and well-known bodies of research literature. But what you said about, like, these are not always available to us consciously. That connects back to what Netta and Guy have been talking about too. It is really hard to listen well enough and to ask probing but open questions to understand the deeper story that's driving the thing that's at the top. So this week I had a conversation with somebody who's about to lose her job because she doesn't want to get the vaccine and she has until the end of the month in California to get it or she loses her job. And it was really hard to listen long enough and well enough to understand the deeper story of where her lack of trust in medical authority and science is coming from, rather than just jumping to, let me tell you the scientific facts about the vaccine, right? And how the comparative risk works. It's not easy. And it's especially not easy because those stories aren't accessible to us. You know, we can't just say like, oh, well, my story about science is blah, 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 and yours is blah, 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 blah. Okay, well, now we're starting with that. We can dive in. It's so much harder. So I can't wait to learn more from Netta and Guy and from you about what are the ways you can do that? What are those open questions that you can use? And what are the cues that you can listen for that tell you, oh, this conflict is not about this conflict. This conflict is actually about a fundamentally different set of worldviews that we're entering this conversation in. I mean, if we had that kind of list, you know, or like little checklist of like, when you hear this, you know, you're in this precarious state, that would be so super helpful in the work that we do. So not saying that we're looking for a checklist, Netta and Guy, but if you happen to make one, we'll be watching out for it.
Well, I think this is an excellent segue to the next question, which really comes from this idea that there's so much information available these days on how to be a persuasive speaker. But by comparison, it's very difficult to find information on how to be a good listener, or even on the benefits of being a good listener. And so this sort of actually merges two questions as it's been asked by a member of the audience as well. Are there practical tools, specifically maybe some open source materials, things that people could use either to learn how to be a better listener, or maybe do workshops on how to be better at listening? And I appreciate that, Netta, as you mentioned, for some kinds of listening, it really takes years and years of training. But for you or Guy, any quick tips you might have for us would be amazing.
So first of all, it's regarding the first part of the question. You know, when I started my dissertation, it was in a business school, and people would tell me, "What are you studying listening? Like, why don't you study something that is related to business? Or did you get confused between clinical psych and social work and communication?" Because people often think that, as you mentioned, we need to be persuasive speakers, but the listener is rather passive, and we know that good listeners gain trust by their speakers. They are better liked. They gain more knowledge. Brie talked about the stories. If I really want to get insights on where you come from and I'm a good listener, I will gain knowledge, satisfaction in relationship. There is so much evidence out there about what are the benefits from being a good listener. And with regard to the open, there are many forms of training, and there is, and I saw the question, I'm happy to also send, there is an upcoming paper in the annual review of organizational psychology and organizational behavior that has a description of different listening activities that can provide an example, because listening is like a muscle. You have to train it. Often when we do these interviews, we get asked like, okay, so give me the 5 tips. How do I become a good listener? And the first thing I think is the mindset. We talk about the mindset that you have to set yourself a goal that you really want to be a good listener, because it will require motivation and it will require energy. And as you will need to be non-judgmental towards others, you will also need to be non-judgmental towards yourself when you find out that you're not such a good listener as you thought you were to begin with. And this is what we often see in listening training, Netta and I. So there are a lot of evidence, and Netta and I are working on making more. Netta talked about the guide for listeners. Like we're working on a guide of how to create a comprehensive guide to help train people to become better listeners. So there is stuff, and we're working on more. And I am sure Netta has to add.
Yeah, can I add a little bit to that, which is agree with all that. I think I just want to add that one of the things, you know, when I think about our developing manual, the first section is on the values of a good listener. And it's not just the mindset of, I want to achieve the goal of being a good listener. So I'm willing to put aside my desire to speak all the time so that I can attend, but it's actually really, really important. We think, and there's some evidence to believe, but there could be more, that the good listener is one who's an authentic listener. And part of the authenticity is not just, you know, I'm authentically not talking, but it's about me valuing you, the speaker, in the moment, and putting aside really those gut reactions and those gut emotions. And that's some of the toughest parts. So it's easy to teach someone to convey their attention because they're not speaking or interrupting, or because they're nodding their head and making eye contact. There's those concrete behaviors, and those are actually really important as well. And we tend to kind of clump them all and say, you know, do good listening, but actually the other part that is really easy to forget, but extremely important for really high quality listening that, you know, I anticipate would achieve those kind of outcomes. It has those values. You know, the mindset is at the heart. It's not just a kind of concrete goal. So I want to add that, and I think the power in it for me, you know, listening to all of you talk today is really that when we have these kind of attitudes that are habits that are ingrained in us, that are part of our identities, that come from our important relationships, there's a lot to lose for people when they meet somebody with different attitudes and different mindsets, because that person threatens all of those things, their identity, their relationships, their culture, their background. And there's a lot of power, I think, as a listener to creating a space where, you know, you can be yourself and you can be understood in the moment. And it's kind of the element of surprise in a way, that I'm sharing something. I expect I'll be rejected because you disagree with me. I expect I should feel threatened, defensive, have that dissonance that Brie was talking about. But actually, gosh, it doesn't feel like that right now. So I think that there's a lot of power for building that relationship, which both the speaker and the listener benefit from.
Yeah. Can I share a tip? I think we owe you like at least one tip. When you try to listen to someone, if you want to listen well, think of a good question that you want to ask them. And a good question is a question that promotes the needs of the speaker rather than the curiosity of the listener. So, for example, if someone is talking to me about her or his unwillingness to get vaccinated, instead of trying to ask a question, showing them why they are wrong, like leading them to a specific answer, this is not a good question. A good question is an open question, and try to think of a good question you want to ask this person. And you will see it's not easy. It's not easy because when you ask a good question, you convey both understanding and openness. And this is not easy, especially in the context of different opinion and different stories. But it is, we see from our work, it is a very strong tool when people feel understood. So a good question is a technique to help them feel understood and gain insight, delve deeper into their stories if it is done correctly. So this is one tip, at least so I feel that we gave you one thing for the, we have more.
That is a useful pro tip. Think about a good question that promotes the needs of the speaker. Absolutely. Well, thank you for that. I think it's interesting that listening feels like it ought to be so intuitive, but it's so difficult sometimes. And possibly one element there is that it's very tempting to think of ourselves as rational creatures, and we're great at listening and so on. But then we encounter some kind of polarizing issue, or something that's difficult, including social issues such as ongoing prejudice, that shows us we're not quite necessarily as rational as we think we are. Again, this comes back to having strong emotions about it, and us not having complete control over our emotions and over how good we are at listening. So I'd love to maybe hear from Jordan on the question of, or at least to start, but from anyone who has a thought. What can we learn about our emotions to maybe help us reduce prejudice, as you said, Jordan, in your field, or at least to be better listeners?
Yeah, I'm going to hijack your plan for 1 second, because I think I have a good example of just how important the research on listening and stories is being done. And so I'm speaking from a practical position in the Canadian context about programs that are designed to reduce prejudice. And it matters because it's a model that's widely used in other countries, but most projects use the same basic model, which is a combination of exposure and perspective taking. And the idea here is that you're going to hear from other people. You're going to learn about their experiences as victims of discrimination. This is going to cause you to empathize with them and then reevaluate your attitudes and behaviors as a result. Obviously, this depends on whether or not you're listening. It assumes that people do listen. It assumes that they want to listen and that they're good at it. But there's mixed evidence about the effectiveness of these programs. And I think, socially, we need to have a serious conversation about what things we need to incorporate in them. And that conversation needs to involve listening and incorporating literature on how we listen into those designs. So I hope that articulates just how important this research is. So to the question about, we think of ourselves as rational creatures and what we learn about emotions. What's interesting to me, and what I'm interested in focusing on is to what extent, our attitudes and behaviors might be influenced by how we manage our emotions. The experiences, emotions we have, and what we do about them. It turns out people differ on their emotional experiences. And it turns out people who are very sensitive to threat, who are more likely to perceive things as threatening. So they see a caution and danger sign that's very arousing for them. They see rotten food, they see a big dog, and they have a strong response to that. Well, those individuals are much more likely to have the prejudicial attitudes of individuals who are less sensitive to those kinds of stimuli. But what's missing from the literature is a deep understanding of why. How do we go from feeling uncomfortable or having discomfort to prejudice? What's that intermediate step? And I guess part of the problem is we have a capacity to think about and reflect on our emotions. I can ask myself the question as well, I felt uncomfortable in this scenario, but was it right that I felt uncomfortable in this scenario? What did I choose to do about it? It's not clear people do that. In fact, that's just evidence that they don't tend to do that. But, are different strategies for processing those emotions? How do those relate to threat and prejudice? How does that relate to individuals who are strongly disposed to experience threat and who are more likely to develop prejudicial attitudes as a result? So that's a core question about emotions that we're really interested in answering.
And I think if I may to continue on Jordan's point, Carl Rogers, one of the noted fathers of modern psychology, talked about it more than 60 years ago as one of the enemies of listening is fear of change. People even sometimes subconsciously fear that if I really listen to someone, I might have to change. And this change can be threatening for me. Think even about an argument in the family between two romantic partners. Each side is trying to change the other person. And when the other person speaks, so the listener thinks, okay, how am I going to react? So Rogers talked about this fear of change, which I think also is relevant to echoing what Jordan just said. And Rogers also talked about our tendency to evaluate. When we hear information, we automatically evaluate what we think. So let's say that Dawid, now you're listening to me, so automatically we think, do I agree? Do I disagree? And these are automatic thoughts. Some evidence suggests that we can listen to twice as much information as the other person can speak. Like we have 2 ears and one mouth for a reason. And we complete this gap, the listening speaking gap, by automatic thoughts that Rogers referred to as the tendency to evaluate, that inhibit or prevent us from achieving good communication, whether it is in the context of prejudice reduction or escalating of emotion or conflicts within the family. And I think the more emotional the topic is, the more severe this effect of fear of change becomes.
I really appreciate that note about how we fill in gaps, because it is we use our underlying stories to do that, right? So you do something that I don't understand, or you say something that I don't quite get, I'm going to fill in my understanding of where you're coming from my own position. So I may look at what you're saying as coming from, he just doesn't know enough. He doesn't have the information. But that may not be the story. The story may be that you have a very different way of understanding the world. But I'm immediately doing that evaluation from my story of the way the world works and how you fit in it. And that's one of the places where we really get to these conflicts that we can't even put our fingers on. We can't even really name or understand until we become better listeners. Dawid, we have a couple questions in the chat. Do you want to go to those, or do you have some other questions for us as a group?
Well, I think we only have time for sort of one more question, actually. Sorry, and there's more questions than capacity, unfortunately. I think to pull out one thing from the chat, again, in line with what you said about a fear of change, someone highlighted the quote, "To truly listen is to risk being changed forever." So I think that really speaks to how how important that connection is sometimes. We can maybe I see there's a quick question. I'm sorry, we only have time, I suppose, for a quick question, but there was a question someone asked earlier about whether in sort of cognitive terms there's a difference between what we call stories and facts. I'd just love to know, maybe Brie or someone else, if you have any thoughts on that distinction.
My group was just talking about this yesterday. We've been talking about it a lot. So many of us on my team are trained as scientists, but not all of us. And those of us who are trained as scientists would say, kind of facts are facts, but we also realize that there's no way that we can go out and test for those facts ourselves, right? We trust the stories that come from science if we're scientists, because we understand how those stories were created. So we give special meaning to those stories because we believe in the process of science, and we see that the data that come from our scientific processes fit into the larger theories that we have about the way the world works. But they're still stories. They're stories we give a lot of power to and that we trust in because of the way those stories were generated. If you don't come from that background and you don't understand or you don't see the power of science as a way of knowing, as being important, then you don't put the same weight on those stories that someone who comes from that other worldview comes from. And so to that person, your story is a different story than mine. My story might be what I've experienced. In the context of COVID, my story might be what I see around me, what I know in my own family or community. And what you tell me are your facts that's just another story that I actually can't connect to. So one of the things that we really, really want to dig into here is this notion for scientists that facts in some ways are stories, but they're special stories to us because of the way we got to them. But helping scientists understand that not everyone is going to give that special weight to those stories that have come from science. So where that takes us, I don't know, but it's one of the things we're going to dig into, and I'm so glad that you phrased your question that way.
Great. Thank you. Well, unfortunately, this is all we have time for, and I want to be respectful of people's schedules, and before everybody has to leave, I want to again thank our panel for speaking today, and thank everybody for joining us. Please do join us next time for our third webinar, which is entitled Flourishing Under Adversity, and it will take place on Friday, October 8th at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. And the session will be moderated by my colleague Bonnie Zal, with the participants being David Addis, Debbie Carr, and Shige Oishi. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us. It was a wonderful conversation, and I look forward to continuing it.